Okay, hello all. My name is Grace Litsu, and I'm so grateful for your time today as I present. When we were introduced to the concept of program evaluation research, my understanding was that our research could be used to shed light on gaps in resources. So to give a little bit of context, the beginning of our course coincided with the suspension of the University of Nebraska Lincoln's chapter of Phi Gamma Delta, or Fiji, as it's colloquially known. Um, Following multiple allegations of sexual assault in their house. This reinvigorated discussion about sexual assault on college campuses across the country and sparked me to consider how the reality of sexual assault affects our very own Creighton. Therefore, I thought this course would be a good opportunity to consider students' perceptions of what barriers exist to reporting sexual assault on our campus. Okay, to give you a little preview of what to expect from this presentation, I wanted to briefly go over the various discussion topics. So to start, I will provide a general overview of sexual assault and some research findings to stress the gravity of the topic. Then I will introduce my partner, the VIP Center, to discuss their role on campus and why I'm choosing to work with them. Next, I will dive into the methodology of the research and walk through the process of the data collection, beginning first with a discussion about my focus prompt and the brainstorming process, and following with the demographic questions and sorting and rating process. So from that, I will go into a discussion of methods. I will describe the concept of the maps and the data analysis, and finally, I will talk about implications of the research and broader recommendations. So to provide a little background and create a common ground definition of sexual assault as we move forward, I wanted to draw on a formal definition used by the United States Department of Justice. So to them, sexual assault is any non-consensual sexual act, including instances in which the victim lacks the capacity to consent. So this definition provides a foundation for our discussion, but I would like to recognize its vagueness and point to this as a potential issue when it comes to addressing the complexities of survivors' experiences. In the literature, I read about previous research done on the topic of sexual violence on college campuses. I found a couple of points that I just wanted to highlight to build on that definition and to continue to build that common ground for the presentation moving forward. So in an article published in the Journal of Trauma, Violence, and Abuse, Stoner and Associates found that at least 23% of women experience sexual assault through physical force, violence, or incapacitation during their undergraduate years. Of these survivors, 80% do not formally report their assaults. In fact, Spencer and Partners points out that college students are consistently less likely to report than the general population. Not only does this paint a picture of the prevalence of sexual assault on campuses, but also points to a broader safety concern. There are large numbers of people experiencing sexual assault, and of these people, the majority choose not to seek sanctions against their perpetrator, which normalizes the behavior and fosters a negative culture around intimacy and consent. This is especially dangerous on college campuses because typically undergraduate years are years when people begin exploring intimacy and areas around that. So it's important to create a environment of safety around those. Unfortunately, we also have gaps in our understanding of just how big of an issue sexual assault is on campuses because schools have a tendency to underreport in order to protect their image. This means that our numbers come from student voices, and obviously we believe these student voices, but we are lacking the representation of the voice of the school. So clearly something here needs to change. All right, so in considering how this information could be useful and what are areas of campus that would benefit most from this information, I immediately thought of Creighton's VIP Center. This is the Center for Victim Intervention and Prevention on campus. The VIP Center is located in Lower Brandeis and exists to support students, faculty, and staff who are experiencing violence in their friends and family by providing free and confidential advocacy. So such advocacy takes many forms and it looks a couple of different ways. It can include walking survivors through the reporting process and helping them make decisions about how to report, but it also includes education programming such as educating on consent through Consent 101 presentations to freshmen, various peer educator programs, and Green Dot bystander training, as well as other educational programming surrounding topics of interpersonal and sexual violence. So obviously these issues and advocacy that the VIP Center deals with are very important, especially to the well-being of the Creighton community and the safety of students and faculty alike. Since the presence of sexual violence on campuses remains high, it is crucial that students have access to necessary resources to speak up about their experiences. And this means creating an environment that supports reporting and makes it easy for students to come forward. I wanted to work with the VIP Center so I could connect them with the perceptions of students when it comes to factors that prevent reporting so that we can work to target these barriers and make reporting easier for students. So in my research, I used a mixed methods approach called group concept mapping. Formally, group concept mapping is defined as a structured methodology for organizing the ideas of a group or organization to bring together diverse groups of stakeholders and help them rapidly form a common framework that can be used for planning, evaluation, or both. So it's pretty heady, but basically it's a research project that has an outcome that is represented in various maps and gives a blend of qualitative and quantitative data to show how individual perspectives relate to one another. Specifically for our research, we used a group concept mapping software called Group Wisdom. The software was used to conduct data as well as to complete the statistical analysis and produce those maps that we will look at later. I will give a more in-depth discussion of this methodology as we go, but I wanted to provide a little background of the steps involved in the group concept mapping process before we get too far into the specific details of my project's findings. So that first part in the flowchart on the left there involves the preparation process. So this is choosing a focus prompt, which participants will respond to, and also selecting the participants you want to be part of it. The second step is entering into that brainstorming phase in which participants actually respond to the focus prompt and statements are generated. In the second stage of data collection is the sorting and rating stage. Here, participants are asked to respond to demographic questions before they sort statements into groupings based on similarities they see and rate each statement based on a rating prompt. After all the data is collected, maps are created. And finally, we reach the data analysis stage in which maps are interpreted and suggestions are made to the organization. So the focus prompt that I chose to frame my brainstorming responses asked participants to finish the statement, "Students choose not to report because." So just as I did in my presentation to you all, I wanted to start the focus prompt by providing a little bit of background into what sexual assault is and why it's important to understand why students often don't report. And the focus prompt that I landed on is on the screen and reads, "Sexual assault is defined by the US Department of Justice as any non-consensual sexual act and unfortunately is experienced by a large number of college students. However, these incidences often go unreported on college campuses. Taking this into consideration, complete the following. Students choose not to report because." So to gather responses to this focus prompt, I partnered with the VIP Center's Consent 101 presentations. So any upperclassmen who were getting trained to be peer educators and give these presentations, as well as all of the freshmen in their RSP classes, were given Consent 101 presentations. And in these presentations, students are asked to use their phones to respond to the prompt. I later received this anonymous data to manually enter into Group Wisdom. So this process generated 272 statements, which is obviously a large amount of statements. And for the purposes of that second stage of sorting and rating in the data collection, those raw statements had to be synthesized and reduced to a more manageable number. And this process of reducing it down is called idea synthesis. In this process, I removed duplicate answers, split compound statements into two, and looked for common themes to reduce the statements without compromising their original intent. So obviously I was able to get a very large range of statements and really see what people perceived as barriers. And then I was able to narrow it down so that we could move forward with the next step. So after finalizing the statements, I moved research into the second stage of data collection, which, as you may recall, begins with sorting. So this is a screenshot on the right here of what participants see when they enter into the group wisdom side and start that sorting process. Sorting asks participants to create piles by dragging and dropping what they believe to be similar statements and grouping them under a pile name. This will help us see similarities between reporting barriers named in brainstorming and recognize overarching themes. So following that sorting process, participants are asked to rate each statement based on 2 rating questions. The first reads, on a scale of 1 to 5, rate each statement in terms of how accurately the statements reflect Creighton students' general experience with reporting sexual assault. The intention behind asking this rating question was to determine areas that Creighton students currently think are areas of concern. These ratings highlight barriers that students feel are currently present on campus, and this question was used to gauge the relevance of the statements produced in the idea generation of the brainstorming to the Creighton student experience. The second states Creighton administration and the VIP Center would like to make positive changes in terms of its response to sexual violence. That said, rate each statement on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of how important it is that Creighton University does something about it. So the second question allows us to create a hierarchy to tailor our responses. The hope is that by asking students what they think is important to address, we can respond to their fears and their needs in a more informed manner and have like more of a basis of what they would like to see us do. So getting people to participate in the second phase was a bit more challenging than the first, just because I didn't have that super easy resource of just having people who have to go to presentations and be involved. So I tried to catch people in as many ways as possible. The VIP Center was very nice to advertise my research link on their social media. I reshared it on my personal social media, and a lot of my friends reshared it on theirs. So we had people get views on social media and click directly on the link. That way, I also worked with Dr. Roadlock to reserve the 4th floor computer lab of Creighton Hall, and I kind of pulled people in the hall and had them quickly participate. And I also worked with the VIP Center to table one day during the lunch rush in SCUT. I had 2 computers out that were set up and ready for people to complete the sorting and rating. And I also had QR codes for people who maybe didn't have so much time and just needed to quickly scan and then go with the hopes of completing it later. At all of the in-person events, I was able to provide incentives. I brought cookies, which I've noticed that when there's food involved, people tend to be very eager to participate. And then the VIP Center very graciously donated some VIP Center tumblers to give away to at the tabling event. So I had to obviously get a little creative, but I ended up with about 50 viable responses. So without refining the data, we had 107 people participate, but oftentimes people would start the process and not go through it with its entirety. Unfortunately, I can't accept the data for people who don't do the whole thing. So I was only able to get about 58 responses that were filled out in entirety for the analysis. So part of that sorting and rating process asks participants to answer various demographic questions. These demographic questions give insight into experiences and can also be overlaid with the sorting and rating data, as we will discuss shortly. But the first demographic question I wanted to ask was about gender, because much of the literature I reviewed analyzed sexual assault on a binary and followed the narrative of demonizing men and victimizing women. And I wanted to ask this question to see how people would respond to this kind of research question. I think it's important to recognize that sexual assault affects all genders and that it is not just men who are perpetrators. There's often women who are perpetrators, and there are other people who experience it. But I was curious to see what the breakdown would be in the context of just looking at who's most likely to respond to this kind of research question, and also just my participants were. So out of the 58 accepted responses, 76% identified as women, 15 identified as men, and we also had 8% respondents say that they identified as non-binary. So then on the right here, the second demographic question that I asked was, which sexual preference do you most identify with? I chose to ask this question because the process of reporting requires survivors to allow themselves to be extremely vulnerable and share a lot of details about their personal life. Also, many of the brainstorming statements I saw involve the idea of privacy and the possibility of exploitation of personal details with that reporting. And these are sentiments that have a large area of intersection with coming out and being openly queer in society. And because of this, I wanted to see how the responses compared to the answers of people who identify as heterosexual, because making this already vulnerable situation easier for a vulnerable population is very important. So of my participants, 73% identified as heterosexual or straight, 16% identified as bisexual, 8% identified as pansexual, which pansexual means that they feel not limited in sexual choice with regard to biological sex, gender, or identity. And this is often described as hearts, not parts. And then I also had about 1% identify as gay. So on the left here, the next demographic question I wanted to ask was about class at Creighton, because I was curious to see how seniority impacted what people perceived as important barriers. And also clearly different grades have different levels of experience. And I wanted to see how this impacted perception of what current factors exist on campus. So about 55% of my participants were juniors, 24% were seniors, 17% were sophomores, and only 3% were freshmen. So there's a little bit of a bias here because I'm a junior, and I think a lot of my friends who are juniors were able to get other juniors to participate in order to support a friend or an acquaintance. So clearly I maybe need to make a little bit more freshman friends, but I wanted to recognize that bias here. Also moving on the right, given that the literature I reviewed touched on the feelings of shame as a factor that could influence the decision to report, I wanted to kind of gauge the feelings that people associate with the topic to see how comfortable people are talking about sexual assault. This gives me an insight into a broader cultural concern about how we address the topic in society and just kind of how people perceive it and what their level of discomfort is, and how that could also influence reporting. So what I found is 33% of participants associate this topic with the feeling of discomfort, 26% with the feeling of fear, and 20% with the feeling of shame. So these were the top three, and they were also pretty negative emotions. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that 7% said that they associate the topic with the feeling of empowerment, and 6% were indifferent. And of course, there's always other responses, and I had about 4% say that they associate other feelings with the topic. So finally, one of the more staggering and interesting results that I got were in response to the question of, have you or someone you know experienced sexual violence? To this, 54, of the 58 participants answered yes to this question. That means that even though it's a relatively low sample size, there was a staggering 93% that have a super high level of intimacy with or a level of intimate experience with sexual violence, and either know someone personally or have personally experienced it. And so we'll discuss these demographic questions a little bit more further, but I wanted to introduce them to give like a background of who was involved. So moving into that data analysis, from the sorting, this is a point map. The point map shows how each statement was sorted and compared to other statements. So this map is solely based on the sorting data. The meaning of the map comes from how close points are located in comparison to other points. The closer the points are to each other, the more frequently the statements they represent were sorted together. So points that appear far apart were either not sorted together very often or they were not sorted together at all. So the point map was created using multidimensional scaling, which is a measurement tool that measures similarity to determine distances to accurately represent how participants view statements. So to give you an idea of some of the statements, we're going to look at this little cluster of 3, 2, and 6 on the right here. So statement 3 stated, they think they won't be believed if they report. Above that, statement 2 stated, they fear the school will not hold the perpetrators accountable. And then above that, statement 6 reads, they fear the reporting process. So these 3 statements you see on that right part there show that they were close together. Statement 2 was sorted with statement 3 21 times, and statement 6 was sorted with statement 3 14 times, and that kind of gives you a sense of like why they're close together. So in point maps, we also use a value called the stress value, and the stress value is used to measure the degree to which the multidimensional scaling fits the original similarity matrix. And those are some pretty large words, but it basically just means that it's a measure of fit. And you want a lower stress value in order to have a better fit. And usually the acceptable range for the stress value is between 0.1 and 0.35. The stress value I generated in this point map was 0.21, so right in the middle of that range. That means the analysis produced an interpretable map, and we can use this visual to show the degree of similarity between statements based on how often they were sorted together. So next I created a cluster map. The cluster map is based on that point map, and it breaks the points on the map into clusters based on how the points are related. The clusters represent different themes found in the statements. In order to create these clusters, a technique called hierarchical clustering is used, and hierarchical clustering partitions the statements as they were placed by the multidimensional scaling. An important aspect of creating the cluster map is to choose the number of clusters. So the fewer clusters shows that there's would have broader categories, and then the more specific you get means the more clusters you have. I chose 7 because I thought it was a good balance and had the best representation of the statements. So the themes highlight patterns and areas that could be focused on based on common statements in our discussion of barriers. So the ones that we generated in the cluster map are justice system, resources related to the issue, fear of retaliation, fear of societal response, barriers from respecting privacy, fear or re-traumatization, and fear in general. So to break down one of these clusters and demonstrate how the theme encapsulates the statements, I want to take a look first at the justice system cluster. So this cluster had 4 statements in it. The first statement is they feel they lack sufficient evidence to hold the perpetrator accountable. The second is they feel that reporting won't help due to a history of police protecting institutions in power. 3 was they are unaware of the resources available to them. And 4 is sexual assault is an underrepresented issue. One of the other clusters is labeled fear of retaliation, and it also had 4 statements in it. These statements are, first, they feel like reporting will cause the situation to worsen. Second, they are afraid of repercussions of reporting. Third, they fear retaliation by abuser. And fourth, they fear victim blaming. So this is just a few examples to show how those larger themes listed here kind of encapsulate and are reflected by the statements in the clusters. So the next 2 slides show cluster rating maps, and cluster rating maps are the exact same as this other map. The only difference is that you see these layers here, and the layers are based on cluster ratings. The layers are based on the rating questions, which I mentioned earlier. This first map shows the average ratings for that first rating question, which was how well students think that the statements represent current barriers to reporting on campus. The cluster with the most layers is really kind of hard to see. It's on the right here, it's really small. It's supposed to be green, but it's number 5. But the statements that fall under the category of resources related to the situation, which is that small one on the right, had an average rating of 4.12 on a scale of 1 to 5. And this means that students feel that statements that fall under this theme are the most common current barriers on campus. On the other hand, the least common current barriers fall under the theme of the justice system with an average rating of 3.76. So then the second map shows the average ratings for how important students feel it is for our institution to work on addressing these certain barriers. So the cluster with the most layers for this rating question also happens to be under that same category of resources related to the situation, which was rated for this question at 4.32. However, there was also a cluster that didn't fall far behind that one and was rated at 4.12, and that is this pink one, which is more visible than that first one. It's number 1, and it is fear in general. The cluster theme with the lowest average rating that students feel is the least important for the university to address is fear of judgment from others, and that is the blue one on the bottom right, which had an average rating of 3.72. Okay, so the next set of graphs that I found interesting deal more with the demographic questions. These graphs use pattern matching and are represented in ladder graphs. They are used to show how 2 sets of ratings compare with each other. The ladder graphs show lines connecting cluster rating values on a pair of absolute or relative scales. And I will talk a little bit more about what those scales mean shortly here. But for now, it is important to note that the pattern match shows areas of agreement and areas of disagreement between different demographic groups. So these highlight important differences in experiences that are noteworthy when it comes to creating a response on campus. All of the pattern matches I chose to include show differences in cluster rating values based on the question of current experience. So I wanted to demonstrate how different demographic groups on campus perceive barriers to reporting, like currently. I also used absolute scales for each of these graphs because I am comparing 2 groups' answers on the same cluster rating data. So it helps to have a same number on both of those sides of the ladder graph. So for this first pattern match, I thought it would be really informative to compare responses from people of different sexual preferences. So if you'll recall, we had 73% of our participants identify as heterosexual or straight, while the remaining participants identified as not heterosexual. And as I mentioned earlier, vulnerability and privacy were common themes in the statements that I saw as barriers, and I wanted to see how an already vulnerable minority population on campus, such as those who are not heterosexual, rated their experience in comparison to that majority heterosexual population. One of the things I like most about pattern match ladder graphs is that the lines show clearly that there are differences in the area and areas of consensus between the 2 groups. Especially in this graph, we see that there is generally a good amount of variation between these groups. For example, when it comes to the barriers that fall under the justice system theme, people who are not heterosexual rated them the highest, while those who are heterosexual rated them the lowest. This means that those who are not heterosexual perceive statements under the justice system category as the most common current barrier to reporting on our campus, while people who identify as heterosexual perceive it as the least common current barrier. On the other hand, both groups seem to be mostly in consensus when it comes to the experience of fear of retaliation because the line was almost straight between the ladders. So another comparison I wanted to make was between students who responded that identify as women and students who responded that associate the topic of sexual assault with the feeling of discomfort. So I wanted to make this comparison because I found in my literature that the discussions of sexual assault are still mostly focused on the culture of toxic masculinity in men as perpetrators and women as survivors. And the feeling of discomfort was also the feeling most people commonly associated with the topic of sexual assault. Also, the highest portion of people who participated in this project identified as women, so I thought it would be interesting to compare these two majorities. Um, as you can see with the lines on the ladder graphs, the differences seem to be a little less distinct than they were in the sexual preference comparison, excuse me. Here, the area of the most difference in the cluster ratings surrounded the theme of fear or re-traumatization. This theme was rated as more prevalent current description of barriers to report on campus by those who associate this topic of sexual assault with discomfort than those who identify as women. I think this could point to the normalization of rape culture and the sexualization of women in our society, because they almost come to expect sexual assault will be something that they will be around or that will be discussed around them. And they're, because of this, unfortunately more comfortable with the topic. I think this makes them less fearful, and as a reason, they see it as less important when it comes, or less prevalent, I see, when it comes to reporting. So despite this difference, the cluster rating for fear and the cluster rating for the justice system had less steep lines and more consensus between the two groups. Finally, I wanted to compare the cluster ratings of those who said they were seniors and those who responded yes to the question of whether they or someone they know has experienced sexual assault. I wanted to compare these two because I wanted to see how the amount of time on campus compared to people who have been directly impacted by the issue. I was interested to see two distinct areas of difference between these two groups. It seems that seniors had a higher average cluster rating for the theme of fear or re-traumatization than those who have had that intimate relationship with the topic of sexual assault. The other stark area of difference is shown by the fact that seniors also rated resources related to this situation on average higher than the other group. The other areas, however, showed more consensus and were rated relatively even between the two. All right, so the last map that I want to include is a GO zone map. GO zones show the average statement rating over a two variable scatter plot. I'm excited to end with the GO zone analysis because it demonstrates the tactical or objective level details, and it provides a more concrete idea of what would be most beneficial to focus on. So as you can see, the horizontal x-axis represents the rating statements in terms of how well they describe current barriers that exist on our campus, whereas that vertical y-axis represents rating statements in terms of importance of addressing and how students rated each statement considering what is important, what is most important for Creighton to focus on changing. Each quadrant represents a different zone. These so-called no zone or quadrant with both variables rated low is the blue quadrant, which represents statements of low prevalence and low importance of addressing. So that orange quadrant and the yellow quadrant are considered gap zones, or zones that are interesting to consider and important to assess in terms of what they say about our campus culture, but aren't necessarily the highest areas of priority. More specifically, statements that fall in the orange quadrant are of high importance but low prevalence. So they're not currently considered to be barriers on campus, but they are areas that students think would be important for the campus to address. However, they may not be the most pressing because they aren't barriers that students consider to be impacting them currently. And then that yellow quadrant houses statements that are of high prevalence but low importance. So there are statements that people consider to be common barriers to reporting on campus, but they are lower on the priority list of addressing by the university. And then finally, we come to that GO zone, which is the area of high importance and high prevalence. This is the green section on the upper right and is the area to put the most resources towards. Statements that fall under this section are fear that the school will not hold the perpetrator accountable. Survivor thinks they won't be believed if they report. Survivor feels like reporting will cause the situation to worsen. Survivor feels that they lack sufficient evidence to hold the perpetrator accountable. Survivor is afraid to talk about their experience. Survivor feels that their experience is not a big enough deal to report. Survivor fears judgment from others. Survivor feels that reporting won't help due to a history of police protecting institutions in power. And then we also have Survivor was under the influence at the time of incident and the fear of victim blaming. All right, to wrap up, I want to reiterate that the prevalence of sexual assault is high on campuses nationwide. As much as we love Creighton, it is obviously no exemption from this norm. And we have a unique position as a Jesuit university to be leaders in change when it comes to improving the culture around sex and rape. And we are called to be aware of what is going on and to do something to create a better and more inclusive, safe environment for all of our students and staff. So part of being able to make these changes is listening to the people directly impacted. This was the hope of my research, and I hope that in highlighting the experiences of people on our campus, that the VIP Center can have a little bit better of a sense of a focus point. Overall, the barrier to reporting that was the highest rated on importance and current experience. So that was number 2, if you can see it all the way on the top right here in this Go Zone map, was that the school will not hold the perpetrator accountable. That being said, I think the VIP Center could begin by educating students more on Title IX proceedings and what the reporting process looks like, so students know what to expect when they report. Students expressed a need of that reassurance that the stress of going through the process will be worth it and that all parties will be reprimanded as they should. And I think that's probably the most important part to start with from my research. All right, so finally, here are my references. I truly appreciate you all taking the time to listen to my research and to consider what it might mean for our campus. I really do understand that this can be a relatively large discussion, but I hope that this research allowed a little bit of a starting point and highlighted kind of areas that most need attention. So thank you all for your passion and your patience. I appreciate you.